being that it's 7 o'clock, or a little after 7 in the morning, get the meeting going. Chuck Edelman is in Madison tonight. He's going to be presenting tomorrow, I think, for the at the State Historical Society about the what library and museum, as far as to do work at the cooperation, to present that at the state level. So I think that's great. Problem is, when he's down there, he can't be here, and somehow I'm not the vice president, so I don't know how he got down to me to do the introductions here. But before we start the meeting, there's a couple people that want to make announcements of things that are going on outside.
Hi, I'm Judy Grumstrong. I'm a part of the Third Act, which is a women's group here in Polk County for women 60 plus. And we're going to have a meeting on October 9th at the Senior Center on a conversation about housing transitions for seniors. And if you'd like a flyer to read a little more about it, it's an open discussion where we can talk about what our housing needs are and how we see them changing. And this is for men and women. So I'll leave these back there with Marilyn, and you can pick one up.
I'm from the Polk County Historical Society, and we have our 75th anniversary this year. And to honor the society, we're having a celebratory dinner on October 23 at Indian Hill in Golden Lake. And the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society will be our keynote speaker. That together, we also are having several musical groups, so we're trying to make it a fun evening. We welcome anybody who wants to join us. The charges are $30 per person for dinner, and needless to say, that includes entertainment. But if anybody's interested, let's see me afterwards. Thank you.
And if I can have that we suspend the fact our secretary isn't here, and on the treasurer not here, but I didn't make it. But if we can suspend the secretary and the treasurer's for the meeting, is that okay? And now, its main purpose of the meeting is the presentation from our guest speaker on who they provided the exhibit on the Jensen display that we have here. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Mark Nielsen. He's the executive director of the Danish Immigrant Museum in Elkhorn, Iowa, and emeritus, emeritus professor of English at Dana College in Blair, Nebraska. In 1977, he was awarded a Marshall Fellowship for study in Denmark, and in 1983 and 84, he was a Fulbright lecturer in American literature at several colleges in Denmark. During that time, he was a consultant to the National Museum of Denmark in preparing The Dream of America, a major exhibit on Danish immigration to the United States. He has written extensively on the Danish-American immigrant experience since that time. Dr. Nielsen was a charter member of the Board of Directors of the Danish Immigrant Museum, serving from 83 to 91, and was again elected to the museum's board in 2000. He became the museum's executive director in July 2003. And I guess with that, and the bio is much longer and more impressive than that, and I have a couple copies of it that Marilyn had back to that. And also would like to introduce Dr. Mark John Nielsen, but he definitely prefers to go by Mark John Mark. I do that all the time.
Yeah, John Mark was that was the name of the Gospel of Mark.
Oh.
Name of John Mark, and in that Gospel, would it be better if I use, or I speak pretty loud anyway? But would you prefer the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
In that gospel, in the story of the last days of Jesus, and in fact when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a little passage in there when Judas brings the Roman soldiers into the garden, and there's a young man, and he's just wearing a brief cloth, and it's ripped off him, and he runs out of the garden naked. And biblical scholars think that was John Mark. So, go to your Bibles and check that out. Well, it is a pleasure to be here this evening, particularly as this represents the first of what I believe, if you would like it, many presentations to be made by staff from the Danish Immigrant Museum. And the reason for that is that, as many of you may know, the Ravenholt family has endowed one of our curators at the museum, and that in our, as an expression of our appreciation, we proposed that each year the museum make some kind of exhibit available to the museum and library here in Luck, and that one of our staff members make presentations of your choice. So we hope that this is the beginning of, in the words at the end of Casablanca, a very beautiful relationship as we walk into the fall. But we're so grateful to the Ravenholt family and to the Albert Victor Ravenholt Fund, which has provided the funding for this relationship. So we want to make the best of it, and I'm pleased to be able to be here this evening to in other words, really initiate the presentations. So thank you to the Ravenholts, and thank you for being here. Maybe if we turn down the lights, then we can turn our attention to Jensen. Many of you have seen the panels on Jensen, so you have some basic knowledge of Jensen. But what I'd like to do this evening is to give you a little bit more of a context out of which he came, and also some of the influences that were a part of his life, and then the contributions that he made in landscape architecture. So the focus for me will be, of course, primarily on the background, and then the influences that he has on architecture. The reason for our interest in Jensen at the Danish Immigrant Museum is that in 2005, 2006, as a part of our strategic plan, we decided to develop the 30 acres surrounding the museum as a Jensen prairie landscape park, implementing many of the concepts of Jensen into our landscaping. And in fact, we secured the services of Professor Emeritus William Tischler, Bill Tischler, from the University of Wisconsin, who designed the plan that you see kind of in the background here behind the text. Our interest in this Danish immigrant, Jensen, was in part because of the way he uses the landscape, but also because of the questions that he asks that are implicit in his work. How do we use the land? How are we going to preserve elements of the land, even as we must use the land to provide jobs and wealth and crops and that from the farming? So it raises questions. We also hope that in visiting the museum, individuals will be introduced to the Western Iowa Prairie, and that is, of course, a little bit different landscape than we find here around Luck, but it is a very important area and a very important landscape as well. So this has prompted our interest, and then also, as we see it, we celebrate the Danish immigrant experience. And so we ask this question: who is or who was Jens Jensen? And of course, he was a native Dane. He was born in 1860 in what was the Duchy of Schleswig. Many of you may know that Denmark was made up of course, the realm, the kingdom of Denmark, but also a number of duchies, the most important being Schleswig and Holstein, at the base of the Jutland Peninsula. He was known for his, Jensen is the father, considered the father of the Prairie School of Landscape Architecture, and I'll be developing that in just a little bit. And then as was written in the New York Times at the time of his death in 1951, the New York Times called him the Dean of American Landscape Architecture. So he's someone who's known in the area of landscaping, but is not familiar with many people, or too many people, to this day. Although, as we were commenting this afternoon, I think it was Bob you'd seen at he has a magazine there. Many of the garden magazines, if you subscribe to the garden magazines, you'll find references to Jensen. There's been a real renaissance of interest in this man. But his work is a premier example of using the regional plants and the regional topography and incorporating that into his landscaping. He's inspired many of the contemporary designers today, and he both created and assisted in preserving developed strong teacher-student relationships. Much of the teaching at the folk school that he went to, and in 1879, so at the age of 19, he attended his first folk high school at Vinding Folk High School, which was up in Denmark proper. Much of that teaching was done outdoors. There were a lot of activities outside, and they also celebrated the traditional celebrations among the Danes. Many of you are familiar with Sankt Hansaften, the celebration at midsummer that predates even Christianity coming to Denmark and to Scandinavia. And likewise, at Christmas, of course that's at the winter solstice, how important the Christmas celebration is. So the seasonal celebrations were also important at the folk high schools, just as they were important for Jensen. And then as so much of the learning was to take place in conversation and in discussions with teachers, learning also took place outdoors, particularly at the Vinding Folk High School. And then in 1880 and 81, he left Vinding Folk High School and went to an agricultural school, Tuna, just north of Copenhagen. And so there he continued that education outdoors, and that influenced him greatly. And then there is something about particularly the Danish culture that celebrates the landscape. I'd like to just share with you, and maybe some of you are familiar with, because these are translations from the Danish hymnal for church and home, two just poems or verses from two of the poets of that time who have been very inspirational. V.S. Ingemann, Bernhard Severant Ingemann, his hymn, The Country Lies in Deep Repose. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it is in the black hymnal. And here are the verses. And I think, again, it underscores this appreciation for nature that Jensen incorporated. The country lies in deep repose, and peace rules hearth and home, while silver clouds the moon enclose, and through the heavens roam. The lake without a ripple lies in heaven's soft embrace. From yonder hills sweet voices rise, and thank the Lord of grace. Relationship between landscape and spiritual belief. And then NFS Comfies, from his hymn in translation, it's Kirkeklove, in translation, Hello Church Bell. And you can imagine, And I've heard the church bells ring out in West Denmark in the evening, and so it sounds very familiar. Hallowed church bell, not for earthly centers, was thou made, but for the village small, where they toll as home and heart that enters, blends with lullabies and even fall. Hence, as now the day is softly ending, shadows fall, and birds have found their nest. With the flowers, my head in silence bending, I am chanting with my soul at rest. That idea, once again, of nature and the spiritual view. So there was a kind of romanticism embedded in the folk high school, and Jensen drank from that wellspring, and it was a profound influence. Before he comes to America, in 1881, following his student days at an agricultural school, he did what every young man living in now Prussian-occupied Schleswig had to do. He was conscripted into the army, the Prussian army. Fortunately, he was stationed in Berlin. And that proved to be an important experience for him, because Berlin at that time, it was the rise of the now German Empire, and the city of Berlin was remaking itself. And there were examples of gardens. And in his work, which was actually not published until 1939, but in his work Siftings, in the early chapters, he talks about his early life. And he comments how being able to walk in the streets of Berlin, he had opportunity to view and to walk through different kinds of gardens. Particularly the two that struck him most was the French gardens and the English gardens. The French gardens were more symmetrical and geometrical and laid out in very formal fashion. And he found that restricting, whereas the English gardens were open. And there is an example of that in the Tiergarten in Berlin. And that he responded to, that he felt was more open and empowered the individual and inspired a sense of freedom. Well, he returned to the family estate in 1882 following his military service. And between 1882 and 1884, fell in love. Now, something I neglected to tell you, he was the oldest son. He was the oldest son of a family that owned quite a large estate there on the peninsula north of Flensburg Fjord. And as oldest son, he stood to inherit the farm, the estate. And it was a large estate. But between 1882, his return in 1881, 1882 from service until 1884, he managed to fall in love with a cottager's daughter, Anne-Marie Hansen. Anne-Marie Hansen was the daughter of a smallholder and worked on the estate. And Jensen asked his parents for permission to propose to her. They felt that she was in station below theirs, and so they withheld permission. And after several years, he decided that no, Anne-Marie was the woman he wanted to marry. And so he gave up his right to the estate and emigrated to the United States. And with Anne-Marie, and as soon as they got to Chicago, they got married. So it's one of those instances where it also suggests something, that he was very strong-willed. And that is something that characterized him throughout his life. Well, he writes in Siftings, as you say here, and this is true for him in 1884, from the shores of ancient Jutland is how he writes it, but I have to say Jutland, a country where every foot of land has had its history, to the prairies of mid-America, a new country, new to the white men, where Indians still roamed the plains and the buffalo still enjoyed the freedom of vast plains endless to the European mind. It was like being torn up by the roots and transplanted into new environments with different habits and a different outlook on life. And this must have been an incredible experience for him. He came in 1884, as I say. He traveled around for several years before ending up in Chicago, he and Anne Marie. They were down in Florida briefly, where he worked on a farm that was a disastrous experience. There was a dairy down there. He went to eastern Iowa, and then in 1886, they came back to Chicago, and he got a job as a street sweeper in the West Chicago park system. And so that's where he began his shall we say, formal employment. But just as an indication of how both creative and innovative he was, that within 8 years, he was a superintendent of several of the parks. And so in 1886, he begins his work. In 1888, he creates an urban garden. And this is an example of the urban garden, the landscape plans that he laid out. The interesting aspect of the urban garden was that it was a garden made up completely of native plants, native flowers to the Illinois prairie, and native trees. And this ran counter to the kind of parks that were being designed in cities in the United States prior to this time. That they were often ornamentals that were imported into the area. And Jensen commented, as did people, that when they came to these parks, they saw plants that they recognized. And you remember that Chicago is exploding in population at this time. And many of the people who were coming to Chicago to live were coming from the farms and surrounding areas. And there they could see then flowers and plants that were native to the area, as well as trees. And that created a sense of recognition, and it was an important step, both in his development as a landscaper, and reflects then this idea of using native plants, which we will see again and again. In 1893, the Columbian Exposition was held, of course, in Chicago, and that too was a shaping experience. Many of the landscapers in the United States of the day, Frederick Law Olmsted, for example, participated in the designing of that, and Jensen was able to take part in the discussions that occurred surrounding the development of the landscaping done for the park. He had already been recognized as early as 1891. His name first appears in the Chicago Park System minutes. He had designed an implement to rake off the green moss on the lakes and ponds in the park system. So it was clear that he was an innovative person and was making his mark in the park system. He also became close friends with Dr. Henry Cowles, one of the early professors at the University of Chicago, a biologist who was interested in native plants, and so they would go on collecting trips around the area and bringing back samples to use and to incorporate, as Jensen did in his plantings. In 1895, 2 years after the Columbian Exposition, he was made superintendent of Union Park, and in 1896, superintendent of Humboldt Park as well. By 1890, he was summarily fired, however, from these positions. A position that not only included being superintendent, but also he was part of the Special Park Commission. But he was fired because he protested, would not go along with the the graft that was expected of individuals in the park system and in the city utilities. If you were appointed to a specific position, you were expected to give back in some way to the alderman or whomever, and he protested that and was summarily fired. It proved to be, however, a good move because between 1900 and when he was fired in 1905, he went into private practice as a landscape architect. And that's when he began an association with Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, you will remember, is considered the father of the prairie style of architecture, and Jensen then complemented him with this landscape architecture that would complement the drawings and work of Frank Lloyd Wright. And in fact, there is a story about one job that they had together, designing a house in a wooded area, and both Frank Lloyd Wright and Jensen were very strong and stubborn individuals. Frank Lloyd Wright insisted that he was designing a house among the trees, or a cottage among the trees. But Jensen said, no, it's trees with a cottage in it. And the person who had hired them liked that. She wanted that idea of a little cottage back in the trees and not this idea of the house having emphasis. And so she took up Jensen's description of it, much to Frank Lloyd Wright's dismay. And in fact, they got into a fight. By 1910, they separated. They respected one another, but they found it difficult to work with one another. Well, by 1905, as you see here, he was then rehired as superintendent of all the park system, the West Park systems in Chicago, and that is when he began to make his mark beyond just simply serving as superintendent. And so, and I'm going to develop this in just a little bit, but you see in some of these pictures from the time how his landscape will incorporate ideas that became important to him. Among them is the concept of a prairie river, a very flat, slow-flowing river, almost like a pond. You'll note in some of the buildings the influence of the prairie style of Frank Lloyd Wright, the low horizontal structures that hug the ground rather than thrusting upward, and the use of circular design. To Jensen, curves were very important, were more interesting than the box shapes of the more restricted gardens, as say for example in a French formal garden. He also had a profound effect on the design of Garfield Park. And there are several parks. If you're in Chicago, I would encourage you to visit. One is the Garfield Park, because it is the conservatory there is of Jensen's design. It was the largest house under glass, if you will, at that time. And he wanted it inside to have the feel of a natural environment. And again, this was a departure from the style of architecture that was prevalent earlier. He also felt that there should be neighborhood parks and schools, and worked very, very hard towards seeing this happen. That there be parks alongside the schools for children to play, because he felt in the urban areas, if there weren't green spaces, children would lose that sense of connectivity to nature and to the land. In fact, in 18... Okay, darling, you go. In 1898, he had attended a lecture at Hull House. You maybe remember Jane Addams was a key figure in the reforming of of the Chicago system and working with many of the poor in the Chicago area there at Hull House. At Hull House, they hosted a lecture by Jacob Riis. I don't know if you know that name, Jacob Riis. He was a very important Danish immigrant social reformer, wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and was a very, actually, President Teddy Roosevelt became a very close friend of Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis gave a lecture at Hull House in 1898, at which Jensen was present, and they entered into quite an influential discussion, at least for Jensen. Jacob Riis was suggesting that the children in the slums needed parks, and that probably had an influence on Jensen as he thought about these neighborhood parks that were necessary. I mentioned that Garfield Park would be an important one to visit if you were looking for traces of him. The best example, however, is Columbus Park, which is in a somewhat blighted area of Chicago, but they have been able to maintain it, and it is used by the neighborhood, and it is always. I've been there several times, and to see how it is used, it is a natural spot in the middle of a very urban environment. And so even as you look at the picture here, it incorporates the Wisconsin wall rock. Jensen liked to use that in his landscapes because not only did it have that rock formation of the cliffs along the rivers, but it was horizontal in nature. That underscores his sense and use of the horizontal, as we'll see. It also, Columbus Park incorporates a prairie river, a very slow-moving body of water through the park itself, and a player's green. If you note here on the drawing, the green here is for the audience, and then looking across the water, you see a player's green. And it was there that that actors could put on masks out in the outdoors. They would give presentations. And it was, again, that idea of helping individuals, to the audience, to understand something of the mythology and yet be doing it outdoors in nature. And then there was a swimming pool. Unfortunately, it has since been upgraded to a modern swimming pool, but the whole idea was to give it a sense of a natural lake, and so it was part of this entire design concept for the park. Well, I mentioned between 1900 and 1905 he went into private practice, and that of course continued even on after he became superintendent of the West Park systems, and so he had some he had some contracts from some very influential people that allowed him to develop some of his ideas. He worked on as you see, the Harry Rubens estate here in Glencoe, Illinois. Very shortly after that, he was commissioned by Henry and Clara Ford to design their estate at Fairlane outside Dearborn. And in fact, if one is looking for many of the archives of Jensen's work, it's at the University of Michigan, and it's in part because of all the work he did for the Fords. But particularly in this estate, he was again able to play with some things that I'll expand on in just a little bit. But I would point out over on the left-hand picture, you see kind of a rapids there. That actually is, they channeled a river to run through there, and then there was a dam. There is a dam, and you can see it in the lower left-hand picture. It forms a kind of rapids-like, and again, it's that idea of the wall rock and the water pouring over it. And this was something that he did at the insistence of Henry and Clara Ford. He had a falling out, however, with Clara Ford because she wanted a very formal rose garden. And once again, it's that conflict that he always felt. He didn't want to, he kind of riled at the formal gardens, and so he argued vociferously with her, and they had kind of falling out he and Clara. Henry remained a very, very close friend of Jensen and continued to commission him to do other works. He also did the design for Henry and Clara's son, Edsel, on the Edsel and Eleanor Ford estate. And also, and this was the longer term work that he did for Henry Ford, that was the design for gardens around the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. Like the playgrounds around the schools, Jensen came to feel that if you have a hospital in a natural environment where people can get outside and walk through a more natural environment, that too can contribute to the healing effect. And so he felt that patients convalescing should have opportunity to be outside and in the fresh air. When the Lincoln Highway was being proposed, some individuals approached him about designing landscape to go alongside the Lincoln Highway. And of course, this is early, the automobile is coming into use, and Jensen recognized that that was something that one could not fight against, but he wanted to see to it that there would be a natural boundary. And so in this ideal mile, you see a walking, or it could be today a bike trail. There were also rest areas. There were places to camp or to stop and picnic. And so in some ways he was ahead of his time in terms of thinking of highway design as well. Well, in all these projects, some themes come into sharp relief. And it is these themes that I'd like to look at just briefly and see how he incorporates it in his designs. We could go back to some of those photographs from the Ford estate or from the parks, for example, and see these as well. One is that he felt that the horizontal, that the prairie, was very broad, and it inspired that sense of broad horizons and open horizons, the freedom that was so much a part of the American experience. And so he looked to incorporate horizontals in his design. He did this through selection of native plants. One of his important plants that he used again and again, a signature, is the hawthorn, and it's a kind of low-growing tree. And so he could use it to serve as a buffer between open grassy areas and larger forests. He would also design it in such a way that the light would catch the color of the trees, whether the blossoming tree here in spring, or after it's lost its leaves and the sun setting and picking up the texture of bark. As an example of this horizontal, he emphasized, or in the plan of a Jensen plan, there was oftentimes a broad view, a wider expanse, again suggesting the open prairie. At the same time, there might be other areas where there's a long view, an area that directs the eye in a particular direction. In the case on the right, it is from the clearing, and it's looking to the west, and at midsummer, the sun sets right down that alleyway, if you will. And so again, the landscape, while one might not know that, yet if one was there at the summer solstice, one would experience that fact that this was maybe like Stonehenge, showing exactly where the sun sets. And likewise, he also used sunrise at important points as a focal point as well. Within spaces, we'd like to create outdoor rooms, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, where you can walk into and feel enclosed, kind of like a wooden glade in an open area. And again, these are places where people could gather, set up chairs, and just experience the natural world. The forms that he incorporated into his parks don't look like human design forms. In fact, there's a children's garden in Madison that was an old rock quarry, and yet he designed the rock formations in such a way that they don't look as if they have been constructed by humans, but are just naturally there. And again, you see the use of the rock to create a sense of falling water. Trying to create buffer areas that can be experienced at different times. The upper left-hand picture is from the border of Columbus Park. And you see a little bit of that design that we saw in the ideal mile from the Lincoln Highway, because you have a walkway bounded, separated from the road by trees to serve as kind of a buffer. Or in the upper right-hand corner at wintertime, that's from the Lincoln Garden in Springfield, Illinois. And you can get a kind of long view curving down through the trees that looks very natural, but is in fact very planned. He did use formal gardens, but in his formal gardens, he tended to like the circle rather than the square, to embed circles within. And that's something that becomes another signature of a Jensen landscape. I'm going to mention it in just a minute again. And then places for outdoor performances. He felt that nature could be a place in which human beings could present the best of what it is to be human. The Ravinia in north of Chicago was originally developed by Jensen, and he had a workshop up there, and then the Ravinia Festival area carried on from the ideas that he had there. He also wanted to, in his design, think about light through the seasons. And so whether you experience it in spring, summer, fall, or winter, the landscape is alive and reflects the elements of all. The lower picture in autumn